All right, welcome everyone. This is your Overcoming Anxiety webinar, and I am very excited to have you here today. My name is Dr. Ty. If you don't know me, you might be joining as a parent. That's where a lot of you are coming to us from. Maybe a mom or a dad, and you've got a kiddo at home struggling with anxiety. They might be having trouble this school year. They might be afraid to go out in the world. I'll share some of my own story in a little bit here. Maybe it's a social phobia or worries. You might be joining this as a parent yourself and also needing support for you as an individual. So I'm happy to have you here because I know anxiety can be a really challenging situation if you're the one experiencing it. And it can be even more heartbreaking if you're doing okay, but you're noticing your kiddo is experiencing it and you just want them to be a happy-go-lucky kid. You don't want them to be afraid and worried. So what we're going to talk about today are some new insights that are going to give you a lot better understanding of what might be going on inside your child's body that can be contributing to their nervous, their worried brain. So to start out, I want to share some of the different types of anxiety, not from a diagnosis standpoint, but from two bigger categories to help you understand your child better. And then we'll talk a little bit about the long-term, the future effects, and then the most important piece today is helping you understand how to help yourself or your child even better. And our focus in how to help is going to be on the brain and the nervous system. So if you have never heard of me before, you might be watching this through our Facebook page right now and wondering, wait, Whole Family Chiropractic, why is a chiropractor talking about the nervous system? Why is a chiropractor talking about helping anxiety? It's something that I've been passionate about since I graduated in 2007. The nervous system and pediatrics have been my two biggest passions and two things that I've spent the most energy around. The style that we do in our office is not a twist, turn, pop, crack, aggressive style, but it's a very gentle way to help calm the nervous system and find where stress is built up in the body and clear out that fight, flight, that stuck stress mode to allow the nervous system to feel more calm, more regulated, more organized. So today's talk is not all about chiropractic, but I want you to know that I'm coming from a perspective of helping many kiddos, many adults over the years in this world. This talk that I'm sharing with you today, it's an abbreviated version of what I've spoken to at the Minnesota Children's Association for Mental Health. They have an annual conference that I've spoken at the last 5-6 years now, and presented this there, and it's been really insightful for a lot of the mental health workers because maybe they're a therapist, they're a psychologist, they're a social worker, and they're working with these kiddos in the framework of traditional mental health, which has a lot to do with stresses from the outside world stressing the brain on the inside. And while that is very common, very valuable, if you're watching this, odds are you've gone through some of those approaches. Maybe you've done work with your therapist or your kiddos doing their weekly sessions, and you feel like things are a little bit better, but you're just kind of like putting a band-aid over things. You're seeing some improvement without really getting to the root of things. And that's what I want to go into more today to help you understand. So before we dive into the two different categories of anxiety we're going to talk about, I want to share my own story briefly so you have an idea that I'm coming from a perspective of understanding what it feels like to be nervous, to be anxious. When I was growing up, I grew up outside of Wausau, Wisconsin, and was happy-go-lucky kid. I loved playing outside. These are pictures of these big hemlock logs. My dad built the log house when I was a kid. Loved playing outside in the woods and enjoying nature, and it did pretty well until from when I was in 5th grade. So I was in the country school. We went to 6th grade. I went to the new middle school and junior high in the central part of Wisconsin. Ultimately, my class went from about 25 kids to 330 kids. This is an actual picture of our auditorium. And I went from, those handful of kids in my school to all of a sudden 1,000 kids in my school. So when I went into 6th grade, I went from this level of engagement all of a sudden to shutdown mode, to worried, anxious. And I started expanding by the end of 6th grade. However, at the end of 6th grade, I got home from school one day and my mom and dad sat me down and they said, Ty, we love you very much. You and your sister Dakota mean the world to us. However, we've fallen out of love with each other and we're getting a divorce. So a big change to myself in sixth grade. Ultimately, that summer, we moved an hour north and I started a brand new school in seventh grade. It was up in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, home of the hodag. If you've ever heard of the mythical creature that wanders around the woods up in Rhinelander. Anyway, now there was a whole new level of shock because it's not only more kids, but it's a brand new environment, new teachers, new school, new halls to go through. And I remember one of the first days standing outside on the playground against one of the brick walls, and my palms are sweaty, my face is flushy, and my heart's just pounding because I'm looking around and I'm seeing all these kids playing, and I don't know a single one. And I'm just nervous as can be. What are they thinking of me? How am I going to fit in? This is going to be a really tough year. And fast forward a couple weeks, I was in math class. Mrs. Knox, our seventh grade math teacher, asks a classic question. And I remember Dustin sitting next to me, tries to answer it, gets it wrong. And I'm like, well, I'm good at math. I know the answer. I raise my hand. Mrs. Knox calls on me. I get the answer right. And she's like, yep, you got it, Ty. I have this moment of feeling great. And then instantly, I'm also shrinking back, thinking, wait a minute, Ty, you don't know anyone. You got to make new friends here. You can't do that by showing people up. And from that day through the rest of middle school, through high school, into college, I never raised my hand again in class. So when it comes to your own kiddos, know that I went through a lot myself and feel happy to share this message because now I'm doing way better. Much easier going to social situations. I much easier expand my energy out into the world rather than shrinking and retreating and protecting myself back into the world. That's a picture of myself and my sister there. All right, so let's dive in then to the two categories that we look at anxiety coming from, different from a diagnosis. If you go to the doctor, they might say, oh, there's generalized anxiety disorder, or there's panic attacks, or maybe a phobia, and start to categorize social anxiety, all those pieces. And while that specific of a diagnosis might be nice to help you understand triggers a little bit better, it doesn't take the step back that we feel often is needed in our office to understand why is it happening in the first place. So the two categories that we like to look at things from are this outward category and an inward category. Outward is going to be some of the things you more commonly see. And I know my camera is covering up a little bit on the bottom here, so I'll list those off to you. But outward is what I think of as the fight-flight response. This is when we first get stressed, our body goes into fight-flight mode, and you see signs of fight-flight. So you might see, in my case, when I mentioned being against the school wall, my heart's racing, but you could see the redness on my face, or you could feel the sweat on my palms. In your kiddo, you might see a kiddo that's really high energy. They're always fidgeting. They're always moving around, whether it's their minds racing, they're talking, they almost might feel jittery sometimes. The level of explosion or bad temper or defiance, those mood things, those behavior things, those control things likely are more observant. A lot of times if a kiddo's anxious, they're going to want to control the situation because control helps to feel safe. So it's part of their natural defense mechanism. We see a lot of families in our office who they're bringing their kiddo to us and the behavior is on the surface. But if we look underneath that, we find there's a reason for the behavior. Their body's doing that for a reason. Their brain's doing it to help to feel safe and protect themselves. This kiddo might be more like perfectionist and like want others to be perfect. There was a 6-year-old boy that came to us once and I asked Mom, what are your goals? And she said, I just want him to go with the flow more easily, be less controlling. And I asked the little boy, what are your goals? He goes, well, when I'm on the playground, I want it so when I tell kids what to do, they listen the first time. And I had to laugh because it was this classic of example of some internal insecurity of him he was portraying outward to try to control the environment. Because this side of things, this fight flight side, is more outward, that's where you might see kind of that bad kid label: behaviors, tantrums, meltdowns, getting in fights at school. And at the very bottom here it says misdiagnosed as ADHD. So there was a 4-year-old boy in our office once who, when it came time for his exam, all of a sudden he's moving around the office. He's like, "Oh, I gotta go check this toy over here. Oh, I gotta go behind the table. Well, what's this going on? I gotta go play with my sister." And on the surface, if you just saw that part, it would look like he's kind of got an ADHD brain. He's too scattered all over. But really, it's because he started to feel fear, and he was doing that to distract from the fear and try to avoid the situation. If we go on the next side here, this is the inward category, which has to do with now going beyond fight flight. So if we're starting fight flight as the initial response for the nervous system, when we get ultra stressed, if our body can't handle it in the moment, it goes to freeze mode. And this was what I can relate to a lot in my childhood, is because I didn't want to cause a scene, so I didn't put up a fight or I didn't run away. I wanted to be a good kid. So freeze mode was my default mechanism. So on the surface, things often seemed okay. However, on the inside, there was a lot of withdrawn, shut down, shyness. For myself, I was more perfectionist and hard on myself. I figured, well, if I can not make a mistake, no one else can judge me, no one else can blame me. So I got really good grades in school. I tried to always not do things wrong. If someone said, "Hey Ty, what do you want to do, A or B?" I say, "I don't care, you decide." So just almost going with the flow because I didn't want judgment. In this case, transitions might be really tough because you're afraid of what's on the other side of the door. You're afraid of, if you go to a birthday party, how's it going to go? And because all the energy is stored inside, body symptoms might be more likely. I'll share as we get near the end here, there's an 8-year-old girl that we started working with who, if she was nervous, mom said she started throwing up for half the day. So maybe headaches, digestive issues being off, weak immune system, feeling nauseous. I reflect back, and I don't have any scientific proof for this, but I had a lot of acne when I was a teenager. And I also reflect, yeah, aside from hormones, that was the most nerve-wracking time of my life. And I'm curious if all that stress and worry was built up inside and it needed a place to go. And it came out through my skin. And as I said for myself, that people pleaser category is something that I can really relate to here. So with all that then, what happens is over time, yourself, your kiddo, you start to go into protection mode. And I'm going to reference the castle here because we're going to come back to it a little bit later. But ultimately, you want to protect from the world intruding on you. And so if there's a lot of stress coming from the outside, you're going to say, well, if I build my castle walls really high, that's going to help protect me. I'm going to build the moat really wide, and no intruder's going to get in this castle. On the outside, as I mentioned myself, some of the things you might see, aside from the things I described, like a rapid heart rate, skin changing, dilated pupils is a sign of a fight-flight. It's a sympathetic response. This is going to come from a part of the brain called the amygdala. And whether it is the fight, flight, or the freeze, that initial step is your brain is gathering input and it's sensing something's dangerous. What happens is the amygdala sounds the alarms. Just like when the fire alarm goes off, my son's really into the fire department right now and letting us know how he can fight the fire in our house. The other day he brought his fireman costume, he's 4 years old, and he brought it into the kitchen because he's like, well, if a fire starts in the living room this way, I'll be ready because the kitchen's close to the living room. Anyway, if we go by Daniel Siegel's model, he's a well-known person in the world of children's mental health. He has a model of there's for simplicity here, we'll go with the inside of the brain, and this amygdala is what can trigger the alarm bells. On the outside of the brain, we're going to go to next here, is part of the brain that helps us, in a sense, calm down from that. So this amygdala, I want you to think of on the inside, is what leads to the fight-flight response. And it's the lower brain that when it's happening, you check out from other things. And again, I'm covering up here a little bit, but there's distrust, survival instinct, wanting to win at all costs. Your priority is running away from the tiger. You don't care about learning math. You don't care about connecting socially. You don't care about giving your mom a hug. All you want to do is survive. The front part of the brain, if we can engage that, that is what makes us unique as humans. It's the prefrontal cortex. So this is the part of the brain that really starts to build sustained trust. If we're in school, it helps us solve problems. If we're at work and we've got a big project, we need to access this part of our brain to figure out how to get through that project. And it's really important for social connection. One of the things we see is that if this part of the brain isn't accessed, we start to lose that deeper connection, because if we're always in survival, if we're always in fight-flight mode, we don't get to access that love and that connection. And as a parent, obviously you want to be able to love and snuggle your kiddo, and you want to develop that bond and that relationship. And if you're a parent and you're seeing these anxieties start to build, you might also be wondering, how is my kiddo going to do if they want to develop a relationship with another significant other in the future? So that's something really rewarding that we get to do in our office, is start to see that connection start to come back. Had a mom recently comment how when her kiddo was under care for a couple months, that her son was, the daycare provider reported, he's suddenly more loving to me, he's more affectionate to me, he's more connected to me, because his brain was starting to be able to open up into the world rather than be in retreat and protection and fight-flight mode internally. So these two parts of the brain that I just mentioned, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, are very important, because what happens is, if the amygdala, this top row in green, green means go, if the amygdala is scanning the environment and it knows things are safe, it then allows information to connect to this front part of the brain. And this is the front part of the brain that is undeveloped in kiddos. It's the part of the brain that also has control over reacting. So in a sense, like thinking twice. One of the reasons kiddos are more impulsive is because this part of the brain isn't fully developed yet. And so being able to weigh, like, all right, I'm in the middle of Trader Joe's, is now a good time to have a meltdown or not? That comes from this part of the brain. That's why a toddler's more likely to have a meltdown compared to an adult when they're grocery shopping. Anyway, if this is able to get access, that part of the kiddo's brain develops better and better, more and more over time. However, if the amygdala starts to sense fear, that's this bottom row here, red means stop. It says no more connection to this. In a sense, you pop the lid, you flip the lid, and all the energy goes into fight-flight response in that lower brain. So once fight, flight, or freeze get activated, we lose access to the upper part of the brain. So not only in that moment are we not going to be able to think rationally and make the best decisions, but long term, if a kiddo especially is stuck in this state going back very early on, it means that they're going to start to lose out to this wiring to be able to start to develop this connection. So if they're always in fight flight and their lid's always popped, now they might try to get connection, but boom, it pops back up. They're losing out on this development here. And that's why the longer things stay stuck in the body, the longer it can take to overcome and get things rewired. I mentioned Daniel Siegel earlier, and Dr. Siegel, this is a quote from him. He has this human connectome project, and basically the connectome is how interconnected your brain is. So if your lid's popped, there's a disconnect. If things are connecting well and this wiring is happening from the top to the bottom to the top, all the different areas of the brain are connected and wiring together, it's one of the best predictors, he said, of how your well-being is long term. And part of his conclusion as well then is the more interconnected your brain is, the more self-regulating a person is. And self-regulating means that when you are feeling stressed, you have the ability to self-regulate and bring yourself back down from it. So next, we're going to go into 3 strategies of how to apply this. 3 specific strategies that are going to discuss allowing this part of the brain to calm down to allow this part of the brain to come online. The first strategy is labeling emotions. So this is something, if you want more info, go to my wife's website, samanthamo.com. She's a parent coach, and she's an expert at helping parents understand triggers for their kiddos, and an expert on giving parents strategies like this to calm and ground not only themselves but their children as well. And I know this is going to show up really small on your screen, but what this says here is there is a brain imaging study done at the University of California, Los Angeles, and this psychology professor found that when they showed people faces expressing strong emotion, and what happened is the amygdala started to light up. Obviously, that's going to generate fear and trigger a fight-flight response simply by seeing a face with strong emotion. When they labeled the emotion, the activity moved from this area, and it says here, to the area that governs rational thinking. So it allowed this part of the brain to come online. An example of that is if someone has a fear of spiders and they see a spider and they know it's on the outside of the building, but their heart still starts racing. Their blood still starts pounding, right? Their heart's pounding, their blood's flowing everywhere. They go into fight-flight response, even though their logical part of the brain knows it isn't a danger because it's not in the same room as them. That's because, boom, when this happens, fight-flight takes over. When they label the emotion, you look really scared right now. It actually helps bring the rational thinking part into play. The second strategy has to do with breathing. So strategy number 1 is when you see your kiddo struggling, instead of saying, not right now, we're in Trader Joe's, we've got a dentist appointment in an hour, we don't have time for this, you say, oh man, you are mad right now. So strategy number 2, deep breathing, is something obviously you've heard of before. However, I want to take it a step deeper for you. In order to activate that thinking part of the brain even better, take you out of the emotional state of the brain, 2 things I want you to do next time you do deep breathing. 1 is put your tongue on the roof of your mouth behind your front teeth. That helps connect emotional to more reasoning, connect the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. And then when you breathe in and out, if you breathe out longer than you breathe in, that also activates the brake pedal side, the calming side of the nervous system. So the example here I got from Dr. Andrew Weil, probably almost 20 years ago now, is a 4-7-8 breath. You breathe in for 4, hold for 7, breathe out for 8. So we'll do one here together. So put your tongue in the roof of your mouth behind your teeth. I want you to start breathing in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Breathe out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you can repeat that 2 to 4 cycles, and that's going to help activate the calming part of the brain. This is a good one I recommend maybe on the way to school, on the way to work, or at the end of the day to help decompress. And then the last strategy I want to share before we go into what patterns can be stuck on the inside and what you can do to really deepen your help and not feel like you're just having to do these strategies all the time. The third strategy is looking into the distance. So what happens is when we're worried, if we can be outside or somewhere where we can look into the distance, it also does the same thing. You can see the theme here, moves the activity from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex, to the calming section of the brain. So this is one where if your kiddo or your spouse you guys need to talk about something. If you can go outside, go for a walk, not only are you getting the physical movement, burning off some of that stress chemistry, but when you're outside, especially if you can be walking along a river or maybe in a park with a field or somewhere where you can see a good view, it's naturally helping you access the part of the brain that's going to not only calm you down, but start to think of a solution to a problem. So what's in common with those three is getting out of fight, flight, freeze, getting into the front part of the brain. What happens then, the concern is, of course, is if things start to get stuck on, that wiring starts to happen more and more. So there's a saying that nerves that fire together, wire together. The more times one part of your nervous system is firing the same pattern, the more wiring starts to happen. It's a term called neuroplasticity. The more we do something, the easier we get at doing it because our nervous system learns. So if we're stuck in stress mode from early on, the easier those stress responses start to become. And I take my mom for an example here, and I love her dearly. And she's had, unfortunately, a lot of stress in her life. And I can see now where there are times where she was more open and times where she's been more closed. And because that stress is piled up, it's easier for her to be closed. So if you're not in her inner circle right now, it takes longer for her to warm up than it might have for her years ago because that wiring has made her naturally more protective. And here's the thing with this. It's not because she did something wrong or it's not like a bad thing. It's the absolute right thing her nervous system needs to be doing based on the past stress she was under. And that's a big part of this is our kiddos and us as adults, we respond to what's in the moment with how are we going to get out of it and still be okay? How are we going to be safe? And when those stresses build up, our brains naturally learn to do more and more to keep us safe. So any time you look at where your kiddo's at currently or where you're at currently, all it is a reflection of the past. And it's the most absolutely appropriate place to be right now because your brain has learned through neuroplasticity what it needs to do based on all those past experiences to respond the best you can in the moment currently. So that's my mom, my sister, my wife, and my sister and I on the other picture there. And then the last concern that I hear parents expressing is what happens when now something actually does need to be done. Just like the boy who cried wolf story, after the alarm bell sounds so long, pretty soon you start to ignore them. There was a mom who brought her 11-year-old in to see us, and her biggest concern is that she said, when my daughter becomes a teenager, I'm worried about how she's going to do when she's offered something not good, right? If she's offered drugs or alcohol, if she's dared to do a stupid stunt, if she's in the backseat of a car on a date, is she going to have the bandwidth to sense that, yes, this is dangerous compared to before and be able to do something about it? Because if your nervous system is always on high alert, it's going to have a tougher time predicting. There's no bandwidth. If this is baseline and this is fight flight, your body says, all right, I'm at baseline. Oh, I just heard the smoke detector go off. Boom, I have room to go into fight flight and take action. However, if I'm at this baseline, but my baseline is up here, see if I can get my hands even on the screen, but if my baseline is this high, I only have a little bit of room when the alarms actually do sound to take action about it. So you start to be able to have a tougher time trusting your gut instinct because in that, when you're living in fear mode, everything feels fearful. Even the things that should be safe still feel scary. So now your gut instinct doesn't have much room to take over and really tell you intuitively that, hey, we need to do something about this. So as I mentioned, when all this is happening, you might start to feel like you've built yourself this nice protection bubble in the castle. Or in your kiddo's case, you say, yep, we have to do everything perfectly. And this is where things really get exhausting. I've talked to many parents who say, yep, we need a perfect 10-step morning routine. If we do all these things in the right order, my daughter feels safe enough to get out the door and then we can be on our way. However, when you're having to put so much effort in, it feels like you're holding everything together because one step of that perfect 10-step routine goes off and the floodgates open and it's like a bomb just exploded in your house. Or maybe you need the perfect diet and you need the perfect amount of sleep and you need to do your essential oils every morning and every afternoon, and you have to line everything up, right, all day long to get through the day. Well, if that's the case, of course it's exhausting. And if that's the case, it's easy to get discouraged by like another technique. Like, yeah, I know how to do my deep breathing, but I have to do it 12 times a day in order to stay sane. That's no fun. So what I want to share with you next then is what can be underneath all of this. What could be at the root of the problem that could be triggering stress from inside the body. And this is where I get really passionate, because this is what we do in our office, is for the parents and the families that have tried it all and still haven't made headway, or they've tried a lot and they're like, there's just something more going on. This is where we love to talk about deeper inside the nervous system. And if I go back here to this for a second, what happens if your walls are tall and strong and the moat's wide, but there's an intruder who already snuck inside the castle? Well, you were sleeping at night. I remember Robin Hood, and he's swimming across the moat, the Disney cartoon version. He's got the little reeds that he's like breathing through the water. I loved that movie as a kid. And he's like trying to sneak inside the castle because he knows if he can get inside the castle, no one's expecting him in there, and he can do a lot of damage. Or from inside the castle, you can open the drawbridge and let your whole army in to invade. So if there's an intruder already inside the castle, it can be this huge missing piece for families. So what happens then is one of the biggest things that we see inside the castle that's causing stress for the brain is something coming from the spine. A dysfunction, a disconnect, a stress in the spine that's actually feeding stress into the brain. So Dr. Sperry here, one of his key things in brain research is he found that 90% of the stimulation and nutrition for the brain is actually generated by movement of the spine. And he's won a Nobel Prize, as you can see in the picture there. So he's done a lot to really give huge strides to brain science, because he realized that it wasn't everything from the outside that's helping the brain feel calm, but there's a huge amount of things from the inside as well. And you can relate if you think of going back to school. All the emphasis when we learn about the five senses, right, is on the outside world. The five senses. What do we see? Do we see a bully, or do we see something safe? Are we hearing a car accident that might be stressing our brain out, or are we hearing peaceful, calming music? Taste, touch, smell. All these things are five senses that our brain takes in and decides, do I need to sound the alarm bells? That's what our amygdala's sensing from the world, or can I feel calm and peaceful? When this is what we've learned, this is what we emphasize. So in the modern world of mental health, most of the emphasis then is on the external world. Let's find your triggers. Let's find things that make you worried, and we'll just try to minimize those. We'll try to avoid those. We'll try to reprogram our brain to deal with them better. However, there's also things that come from inside the body. There's two main senses from inside the body that we'll talk about today. Spending most of the time on this first one. It's called proprioception. So proprioception comes from all the muscles and the joints in our body. And this, to Dr. Sperry's research, is one of the most calming inputs to the brain. I'm going to go into this one a little bit more in a moment. The other big one is the vestibular system. This is one where if you get car sick, it might be your vestibular system being off. If you don't like roller coaster rides, it's probably this system. This picture here is when my son was 8 months old. We went to this big playground a couple hours south of the Twin Cities here, and we put him on this merry-go-round, and we realized about 15 seconds into it that it wasn't the best move. You can see in this picture, he's gripping tight and he's got a look of fear on his face. And you could see this freeze mode instantly go into play because at 8 months old, he wasn't ready for the circular motion with the up and down motion. It overwhelmed his sensory system and it put his body into a state, fight, flight, immediately into freeze. Poor guy. Anyway, he's doing well now. And we made sure to help regulate him afterwards. But the point was, his system went into that freeze mode, not from something externally, but from something that was shaking his body up internally. So these senses from inside the body can trigger fight, flight, trigger freeze, or they can trigger calm as well. So proprioception, as I said, is one of the most calming senses for the brain. You'd be familiar with this if you've ever used a weighted blanket, or your kiddo loves falling asleep with a weighted blanket on, or just cozying up on the couch and reading a book. That pressure from the blanket is stimulating this sense. Doing something like a bear hug is an example here as well. Being squished is a way to stimulate proprioception, which is very calming for the brain. So if this proprioceptive sense is off, it's one of the biggest things that we see as a robber in the castle. So what happens is, if, open this up here, if all the parts of your spine are moving freely, they're sending good proprioception into the brain. I like to call that calming sense like Kenny G music. You're at a peaceful dinner, a romantic date, you got some nice peaceful music playing in the background, it's calming for the brain. If that is off, if something's off, out of alignment, if something is not moving well, it's now going to send stress into the brain. You can think of that as the opposite of calm, maybe Metallica. I know some people like heavy metal to calm down actually, but most of the time you're listening to heavy metal when you're working out or to pump you up, to rev your engine because it activates that excitement in your body. So if something's off in the spine, it starts to send Metallica into the brain. And as a result, now, even when the external environment is perfectly calm, perfectly safe, there could be stress coming from inside the body that's triggering this response. So what we do in our office, and I'll show you one example here, is we look to see if that's one of the culprits. So this was that 8-year-old girl that I mentioned back in the beginning of the talk, that when she was anxious and nervous, she would have stomach aches so bad that she would throw up for half the day. You can see on her scans here, this is one of our neurological assessments. It's very safe, very gentle. We're not putting any input into the body. We're only measuring what's coming from the body. We're looking for white bars here. And as you can see, there's a handful, but there's a lot of color as well. And where you see that big clump of red, that's actually down in one of the key areas for digestion. So it made sense in this girl's case that not only was there stress inside her body, but that digestive symptoms were one of her key complaints when she felt anxious and nervous, because there was stress inside her body that was causing the fight flight to be triggered way easier than it needed to be, and those areas affected digestion. So no wonder she would throw up. Now, the good news is, as we started getting her adjusted, this is her follow-up scan, and this was, I'm just checking here, a month later. And the cool thing is, not only can you see a much calmer system, you can see much less color, which means those robbers that were in the castle to start with, we're kicking them out, we're finding them and we're tossing them over the side. But now there's a lot more calm going from her body into her brain. So her bandwidth started to improve. I checked with mom a little bit after this, a couple weeks later. I'm like, okay, how are the mornings going? Has she thrown up? How is school going? She's like, come to think of it, she hasn't thrown up for several weeks now. She's much calmer. Getting her out the door in the morning, instead of taking an hour to get dressed, would take 15 minutes. So everything was improving a ton because we were able to start to regulate her nervous system better. Another scan example here, this was a teenage boy who was very revved up. I mentioned earlier on kind of like that jittery, just always, you could almost see his body shaking. In his case, sleep was a huge component. He would commonly wake up at 4 to 4:30 in the morning, revved up, ready to go. You can see in his top scan here, we don't have any white bars. So I mentioned white's ideal, green is mild, blue is moderate, red is severe, and then black as if it's going off the charts. And as a result, all this is stress feeding into his brain. If we look at each of those levels, it's like Metallica's turned up, turned up, turned up. Those black and reds, Metallica's turned up to 10. And it's just feeding that into his brain all day long. When we started adjusting, now you can see the bottom scan here. Again, this follow-up is a month later. Usually we're doing our first progress scan within at the end of the first month. Mom said, guess what, Dr. Ty? He actually, for the first time ever, we had to wake him up before school because he was still sound asleep at 7:30. And he's routinely now sleeping in to those later time periods because we are able to find what was revving his system up from internally and start to clear that out. Now his body could start to experience more peace internally rather than stress internally. This is a video that I find when I show via this style of recording, it the audio doesn't come through. So I'll just explain it to you. Heidi Horvick is a researcher out of New Zealand, and what she's done is hook EEG electrodes up to the brain while giving very specific neurologically based adjustments. And she's found that on average, the average adjustment boosts information to the front part of the brain, what we've been talking about here, by an average of 20%. So if your kiddo's stuck in this mode and this wiring hasn't been able to occur, this connection hasn't been able to occur, the neurologically based adjustments start to make that connection happen. And on average, she said she's seen a 20% increase in activity in this front part of the brain with each adjustment. And then the last study I'll show you here comes from the journal Molecular Psychiatry, and there's one of the techniques we're specialized in, this torque release technique. I'm just going to jump ahead here, but ultimately what they found is those receiving adjustment showed a significant decrease in anxiety, while the placebo group showed no decrease in anxiety. And if you want a copy of that study, let me know. All right, so as we start to wrap things up here, then the last question sometimes parents wonder is like, okay, it makes sense, there might be stress stuck inside the body, but how does it get there? Where does it come from? And ultimately, what it tends to come from is one of these categories of stress at a certain point in life. Physical stress we'll start with on the bottom here. This can really be common actually from the birth process. We see a lot of families where maybe labor was induced, but it didn't go very well. So they had to keep adding intensity of Pitocin. And one mom we talked to, labor as it started, instead of baby's head being in good position, baby's head was over in the pelvis. So now each contraction started to compress and put pressure on the neck. And you can only imagine if labor is going and instead of each contraction pushing baby through, each contraction is compressing baby's neck, that's going to create a lot of stress on the newborn's delicate spine. And that, going back to that story, she wanted so bad to have a natural vaginal delivery that she's like, all right, let's see if baby can turn, if we can do something to get him repositioned. And it just didn't happen. It was 9 hours of labor of him stuck in that position before they did an emergency C-section and pulled him out the other way. Babies delivered via C-section. I've done a lot of trainings where we actually watch videos of what happens there, and usually babies coming through, again, getting turned, pulled out, vacuum, forceps. I was born forceps myself when I was a kid. If labor stalls, if there's anything that throws things off there. Even a really quick labor sometimes is, instead of going through steady, it's just like all this quick pressure as baby's thrown into the world. So whenever we work with a new family, we're always asking about how labor and delivery went. The other physical stress would be learning to be a kid. We had a mom bring her 3-year-old in who said she was really happy up until 1 year old, she fell hard enough, pretty hard on her head. She got stitches on her chin, and fell on her chin, cranked her head back, got stitches, and ever since then she's been like grumpy and moody and ornery. She brought us in at 3 years old. We started adjusting her, and again, within a few weeks, she started to see this turn. She's like, oh, she's getting happy again. Um, my nieces, when they would get adjusted when they were in daycare, mom reported, yep, whenever they get adjusted, daycare knows because they're always in a better mood that day. Chemical stress can be common if a kiddo has been stuck early on, and maybe now things are off and they're getting a lot of, I'm kind of switching gears here, but immune challenges can be common if things are off here. If the neck's thrown off, things don't drain as well. So ear infections, sinus infections, swollen tonsils, adenoids, all this stuffiness, like colds that last a really long time, is a common pattern that we see in a lot of kiddos we work with. So maybe now they're on a lot of antibiotics. That could be a chemical stress coming in. And then the last one here, mental emotional stress, is something that is so prevalent in today's day and age with all the demands of our world, way more than we used to have. And this is something that could even start as early as preconception, if it was tough to become pregnant, or while mom is pregnant. I know for my wife's case, she wanted to get her business, she wanted to get some things ready in her business so it could run without her while after she gave birth. So she was working her butt off during pregnancy at a time when, looking back, she probably should have been a little more relaxed, but that starts to wire the nervous system for more stress. And then just getting through the busyness of getting out the door for school in the morning and getting to work and getting a project done, and then after school activities, and then soccer tournaments and baseball tournaments on the weekend, and life just goes at us, that this stress starts to get hardwired in because we're always in go mode. So ultimately, when those things add up, it starts to create this wiring of stress inside our body that starts to go whether we're created a calm external environment or not. And that's what our scans measure, is we can look to see, is stress built up in the body in a way that it's stuck in there? And if it is, where is it at? And then, of course, what we can do to help. So I'll share one more story as we wrap things up here. Nolan came to see us at 14 years old, and mom brought him in as an 8th grader in the winter in February because she was afraid of how high school was going to go. He was pretty anxious, depressed, worried. Sometimes you might see a kiddo that starts really anxious, and that takes a lot of energy to have fight, flight on all that time. So they might start to become more like exhausted, fatigued, worried. Depressed is because their resources are starting to burn out. If his mind was spinning, it took a long time to fall asleep at night. Really worried about if anything new was going to happen or anything he didn't know. His worry started to manifest internally with stomach pains, headaches, a lot of immune challenges. And mom brought him in to see me, saying, all right, let's see what we can do to get him ready for high school. So we did Nolan scans, we got him processed. We said, all right, we can help. Let's get him going. So we started adjusting him. Mom said right away he's falling asleep quicker. That's one of the biggest changes parents notice, sometimes even as quick as the first adjustment, to give them feedback that things are going well, that their nervous system, or their kiddo's nervous system, is starting to calm down. She noticed, he's like getting a little more brave. He went out to movies for the first time with friends, and she said normally he'd be too scared to even go out, but if he did, like worried about the unknown, he'd have to have everything go super smoothly. He went out to the movies, and the ride that was supposed to pick them up didn't show up. There was a mistake in communication. And so he calls mom, and mom's telling me the story. He calls me, and he's like calm. He's like, hey mom, the ride didn't show up. What do you think we should do? Could you come and pick me up? She's like, what? That's not Nolan. You'd normally be way calmer than that. So very fun to see that starting to expand into the world starting to happen. Mom noticed that he doesn't look as hunched, because when you're under stress, your muscles tighten, you curl forward, you protect, right? He's starting to soften. Coming out of his shell is like a literal term, because his brain is feeling safer in the world. And the cool thing with this is that summer before high school, mom pulled me aside one day. She goes, Dr. Ty, do you have a minute? I'm like, yep. We were just at Nolan's pediatrician yesterday, And the pediatrician asked, "Hey Nolan, how you doing? How's school going? Do you feel like you're ready for high school?" And Nolan looks at the pediatrician. He goes, "This is the first time I remember not feeling anxious, not feeling worried, not feeling depressed." And mom started tearing up, and I started tearing up because it hits you in a way when you hear that wow, this was his life up until that point. Like, that's what he knew. That's what his nervous system was wired as. And mom even relates, oh yeah, back as a baby, he was colicky. He was like stressed that young. And that wiring didn't have a chance to really release itself and escape, no matter how much mom and dad did, because they loved him and they were very caring parents. They had the resources to try all these things, but because the stress was stuck on inside his body, it didn't matter what they did from the outside. Change coming from the inside made all the difference for him. So that's where I get excited to be able to share these resources with you if you have been struggling and you're wondering what you can do to help. If after all this something resonated, if something clicked, if you thought, I never thought about that before, or like, oh, that describes my kid exactly, I would love for yourself or your kiddo an opportunity to get checked. So if you're looking into neurological based chiropractic, in our office, I'll go through what we do. And if you're in the Twin Cities, I'd love to have you in our office and take a look, see if we can help. If you're outside the Twin Cities, shoot me a message, and I have a good network of other docs who've trained similarly and who get great results too, that hopefully I can find a doc in your area. But step one is to figure out what's going on. So if you've never had these neurological scans done, that's always step one, to see what we're working with. So on that first visit, we do the scans, we talk, feel out what's happening and what your goals are. And then we take those and we study them, process them. And then on the second visit, when you come back, now we show you what we found. We go over what your scan showed, and if there's stress in there that we can help with, then we lay out a game plan of what it's going to take to get your kiddo back on track or get yourself back on track. And the nice thing is that second visit, that's when we do the adjustment, and as long as you're like ready to start care, we're ready to get started with you then. But you get an opportunity to meet us first, know what it's going to take, know what it's going to cost financially, know like the number of visits, for how long. You have all the information you need to make a good decision before you would move forward with anything. And as a result, you can feel safe yourself, know you're making a good choice. So if you have any more questions, comments, please reach out, give us a call, shoot me an email, shoot us a direct message on Facebook or Instagram, because we're here for you, and we really love caring for families and giving them resources that they might have overlooked in the past or never even heard of before. And ultimately, we want to help you and your child thrive and be the best versions of yourselves. So we're here for you. Reach out if we can help, and I'll see you soon.